The LSAT is changing. There's no more logic games on the test, so how you study also has to change. LSAC has removed dozens of practice tests from LawHub. There used to be almost 100 released actual official LSAT prep tests. Now there are only 58, and you'll burn through them fast if you're aiming for a 170 or above. Today I'm going to share with you 10 things top scorers do that most people don't even think about. For those who don't know me, my name is Steve Schwartz. I increased my LSAT score from a 152 to a 175 on LSAT test day, and I've been teaching the LSAT since 2005. Today, I'm going to share with you 10 little known ways to increase your LSAT score. The number one biggest thing most students don't realize is that there is value in redoing practice tests. You don't need to worry that just because you've seen it before, you've done it before, and your score is going to be inflated, you don't need to worry that you can't learn something from that test. Unless you would get a perfect 180 upon redoing that test, there is still some value to be derived because every question that you get wrong is an opportunity to learn something new. And if you're getting the same question wrong 2-3 times, you definitely have not yet learned the lesson you can get. That being said, of course, there are some official actual practice tests not available in LawHub, specifically LSAT prep test numbered 7, 9 to 16, and 18. These 10 exams are available in the original first 10 actual official LSAT prep tests book. It is still available on Amazon for roughly $20. There are a handful of others, not in LawHub, but that book of 10 actual official LSAT prep tests is the best source of material if you have already exhausted or will soon exhaust what is available in LawHub, especially important now that they've reduced the number of tests available. The second big strategy is review. Students too often neglect to properly review their mistakes. I have developed a framework for reviewing LSAT questions called the Socratic Review Method. It is a framework, a guideline, a template you can follow to help you pinpoint exactly what mistakes you're making and why on your practice tests or during your drilling so that you can extract the key insight to allow you to study more effectively going forward. We guide you through every element of the question. For example, in logical reasoning, it could be the stimulus, aka the argument or the fact set. It could be that you misunderstood something in the question stem, or it could be that you missed something in the answer choices, the tempting wrong answer, the unappealing right answer. We help you dissect the question from every angle so that you can avoid making that same mistake again. If you'd like our help engaging in this process specifically on the questions giving you personally the most trouble, you can check out the links below the video to find out more and to book a call with me and my team. We'd be glad to help you out. The number 3 little known strategy is to focus on the stimulus, not the question stem. So many students and so many prep companies focus on drilling LSAT questions by question stem type. And I understand why. It's because it is very easy to categorize questions by their question stem type. But the ease of categorization does not determine the value of drilling in that way. It is equally important, if not more important, to make sure that you thoroughly understand the stimulus, because the question stem and the answer choices only make sense in the context of the stimulus. If you don't understand the argument, then how are you going to properly evaluate the answer choices? If they're asking you to weaken an argument and they're asking you which one of the following, if true, would most weaken the argument, how can you tell if you don't know what the argument is actually saying? And so I'm encouraging you here to make sure that you know what is the method of reasoning in that stimulus. Is it correlation causation? Is it confusing necessary and sufficient conditions? Is it an ad hominem personal attack? Or is it a less common method of reasoning like system effect that shows up much less often than the others? Until you understand the argument, you're not going to be able to get the question right. And a lot of review, properly done, comes down to making sure that you know what is the conclusion, what is the evidence, how reasonable is this argument, what are they failing to consider, or what are they not bothering to explicitly state. So I'd recommend first and foremost, start there and consider how could you take a weakened argument or a weakened stimulus and turn it into a strengthened stimulus or a necessary assumption stimulus or a resolve the paradox stimulus with some clever manipulation. This is one of the tactics that we use as part of the Socratic review method when we are working with students aiming for 170 plus LSAT scores. If you are still in the low 160s or the high 150s, I would, of course, instead like the Socratic review method basics I mentioned earlier. The fourth little known strategy is to focus on pacing. I recommend in logical reasoning, if you have standard timing, meaning 35 minutes per section, that you aim to complete the first 10 questions in roughly 10 to 12 minutes to allow you to build up a time bank that you can then apply to the tougher questions later in the section. For those who don't know, logical reasoning questions are presented in a general order of difficulty, meaning they go from easy to hard, they get tougher as the section goes on. So if you have on average a minute and 25 questions per section, it does not make sense to allocate the same minute 25 for an easy question as you would for a more difficult question. Blaze through the easy ones, build up a time bank that you can then apply to the tougher questions later. And by the way, feel free to flag and skip questions to come back to later. Know which questions you don't like so that you don't invest time in them before throwing up your hands in despair and saying, I don't know what to do. Instead, just flag it, skip it, come back to it at the end after you already have the confidence of knowing that you've already locked up all the easy points. Personally, I will flag 3 or 4 questions in a single logical reasoning section of roughly 25 questions because I just don't want to deal with them in the moment. That means I'm taking roughly 17-18% of the questions in the section and saying, I don't like this, I don't want to touch it, I'll deal with you later. So for me, I don't like dealing with lengthy parallel questions that show up late in the section or technical science questions that I'm not as comfortable with given the topic. Of course, given enough time, I can crack that question, but why risk getting bogged down or stuck on it given that every question is worth the same? So know off the bat what you don't want to deal with, flag it, skip it, come back to it later with a fresh look, a second perspective. You'll break out of that tunnel vision and be able to get that question right in the end with the confidence of knowing you've already locked up everything else. The fifth little known strategy is for reading comp, taking fewer notes and getting more accustomed to reading on a screen. I find that far too many students get bogged down and waste time with highlighting, underlining, note-taking when your time is quite limited. You have on average 8 minutes and 45 seconds per reading comp passage and the associated 7 or 8 questions, which means that most likely if you are spending, say, 3 minutes on your initial read of the passage and all the note taking, you're already pretty pressed for time when it comes to solving the associated questions. You're going to have less than a minute per question. And of course, these questions are tough and the time goes by fast. So if you are engaging in overcomplicated, wordy note-taking or strategies that you learned from some reading comp textbook that don't actually work under real-world timed test day conditions, you're not going to have a hope of solving all the 7 or 8 questions associated. And so I've personally found that for myself and for my students, the fewer notes you take, the better. The students who do the best write very little or not even at all because it takes time to write things down and it takes time to read things. And of course, we are not really accustomed to reading difficult, dense text on a screen when we're more used to, say, social media or listicles. And so you might want to use a tool like Phrase Reader or Spreeder to help you get faster at reading difficult, dense text on a screen. You can just copy paste in an LSAT passage or some other academic type writing into that and put yourself on a reading comp treadmill of sorts to get better at reading that difficult, dense text more quickly. The sixth little known strategy is that taking tests in Law Hub is the best way to go. Far too many students are taking prep tests in some private prep company's platform or on Khan Academy when they don't properly mimic what test day itself is actually going to look like. Due to LSAC's licensing requirements, only Law Hub itself is even allowed to look like what you're going to see on test day itself. And so I recommend simulating test day with regard to the littlest details, including what the format of the test will look like, what the platform looks like, what is the font, what is the style of the buttons, what is the style of the countdown timer. All these little things make a big difference and you'd be surprised, but actually the highlighting tools and underlining tools on Law Hub and on test day itself don't really work that well. And the ones offered by private prep companies and Khan Academy actually work better, which means you're going to be in for a rude awakening when you discover on test day that the system you're dealing with when it actually matters with LSAC and with Prometric actually doesn't work that well. And you can't rely on the highlighting and the underlining. You don't want to discover that on test day. Get used to it. on your practice tests. And I do recommend taking at least 10 full-length timed practice tests so that test day itself will feel like just another run through. The seventh little known strategy is that mindfulness meditation can really help. It doesn't have to be spiritual or religious in nature. It could be as simple as focusing on your breath. And I think of it more like you're training a muscle. You're training a muscle of self-control and focus because, of course, we are human, we are animals, we have bodies, and we are prone to adrenaline affecting us when things really matter. Nerves can get the better of you. And if you can train your mind to focus on the task at hand, even with something as arbitrary as focusing on your breath, you'll be able to ground yourself, to center yourself, to focus on the task at hand when you risk spiraling out of control because you don't know how to solve a given logical reasoning question, or you're not clear on what a reading comp passage is saying, when of course, if it was untimed or if it was in the comfort of knowing it's just a practice test, you'd be totally fine. But because adrenaline's getting the better of you on test day, you risk spiraling out of control. And so as little as 5 minutes a day of mindfulness meditation can really help, as simple as focusing on your breath to bring yourself back to the single question in front of you, and you're able to let go of what came before, and you're not yet thinking about what's going to come next. The eighth little known strategy is, again, focused on things outside the content of the exam. Things like sleep, diet, and exercise really do make a difference, not just within the 24 hours before the exam, but in the weeks and months leading up to the exam. Again, we are human beings. We are not robots. We are animals, technically speaking. And so these things, taking care of your body, taking care of your brain health, really does make a difference. If you've ever tried to do a practice test hungover, you know you're not going to do your best. If you're sleep deprived, you're not going to do your best. And so the more you can get yourself into a healthy routine, the better you're going to do. Exercise, of course, powers the brain as well. And so if you can get on a good diet, if you can do some simple exercise, nothing too crazy taxing, of course, but if you can get into a rhythm where you're going to bed early, waking up early, ideally, if your body supports that kind of rhythm and routine, all the better. The ninth little known strategy is getting obsessed with this exam and learning everything about it beyond just taking practice tests, beyond just studying prep materials, but for example, watching my interviews with a guy who used to write actual LSAT questions. They are available for free on YouTube. And these were fascinating to see the way this guy talks like he's a logical reasoning question. It was so funny to hear his perspectives and insights from what goes into making the exam. But imagine if you could see the exam from the test maker's perspective, and you could recognize that this exam, far from being dumb or far from it doesn't test anything important, if you recognize that there actually is some value to be derived from studying this exam, if it could actually improve your reasoning abilities, not just for the LSAT, not just for law school, but to help you think like an attorney, to recognize that these LSAT questions are really like mini contracts, and the tiny little wording differences actually matter a great deal. If you've ever tried to negotiate a contract, you would understand that comma placement and wording, the precision, really does make a difference. So treat this exam like it has something to teach you, because after all, the students who do the best on this exam are the ones who actually recognize that it has something to teach them. They don't think it's dumb. They don't think it's a waste of time. They realize they are getting something out of this exam beyond just the score out of 180. Obviously, we all want the score. We want to get into top law schools. We want significant scholarship money. But beyond that, we also want to improve our reasoning abilities because the exam has something to teach us. I'm going to share the 10th little known strategy in just a moment. But before I do, I wanted to let you know I have an 11th bonus strategy coming in just a few minutes. So stay tuned for that. But the 10th strategy is to choose your test day time the second scheduling opens. You can register for the LSAT months in advance, but you can't actually schedule a testing time on Prometric until a few weeks prior. And getting your preferred time slot is probably more difficult than logging onto Ticketmaster and hitting refresh to get tickets to a Taylor Swift concert. Believe it or not, Prometric's scheduling system is crazy. It is difficult, but you got to do it the second it opens because you don't want to be left taking the exam at 7 in the morning or 10 at night. I exaggerate, of course, but you get the point. And of course, some students do better in the morning, some do better in the afternoon, some do better in the evening. You know what works best for you and your schedule, especially given, say, for example, your other obligations or your body's rhythms. But to get your preferred time slot, choose it, book it. The second the scheduling opens, it'll be published by LSAC. They'll notify you in advance, but keep an eye on that for when it comes. And now finally, the 11th Bonus, little known strategy is to apply for extra time accommodations if you think you might qualify. LSAC used to be far too strict in granting extra time to those who deserved it. They would deny them. The pendulum has now swung the other way because they've gotten sued several times under, for example, the Americans with Disabilities Act by the federal government, also by a blind test taker who sued LSAC, and now that's why Logic Games is removed. Bottom line, LSAC is now granting lots of extra time accommodations for ADHD, testing anxiety, other conditions as well. Seek them out if you think you might qualify. You can get time and a half. You can get double time. I mentioned the 35-minute time constraint earlier. That time constraint is real. It is not easy. If you think you would benefit and you think you might qualify from getting time and a half or double time, definitely explore the accommodations route. And of course, if you'd like my help with this or any other element of LSAT preparation, if you're aiming for a 170 or above, you can check out the links below this video to find out more and to book a call with me and my team. In the meantime, I'll wish you all the best and take care.